Okay, let's move on to Standard 13. Let's look at the overall standard here. The student will identify major efforts to reform American society and politics. So they're going to reform American society, and they want to reform or change American politics in the progressive era. That's our overall focus. So we're going to be looking at this progressive era, and we see reform means change. We talked about that definition before. American society and American politics are going to change during this era we call the progressive era, from around 1900 to 1917, 17 years. And we're going to be looking at primarily the changing of the role of government is a big one we're going to look at. So government's role in the society and in the economy is going to change dramatically. Alright, so here it is. 13 says the student will identify major efforts to reform American society and politics in the progressive era. So we're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 substandards. Big area, big huge standard in Unit 5 here. We're going to finish up our Unit 5 with this standard here. Let's highlight a few of these things and look at them. Upton Sinclairs The Jungle is going to lead to a change in government action, and it's going to lead to federal oversight of the meatpacking industry. The government's going to look closer at the meatpacking industry. And then Jane Addams' Hull House, her reform movements started with women trying to reform society. And then the rise of Jim Crow, or segregation in the South, in this Plessy versus Ferguson case. And then the advent or rise of the NAACP. And then Ida Tarbell, her as a muckraker, illuminating her role as a muckraker, and that of Upton Sinclairs The Jungle as well. And then the significance of progressive reform in politics, such as the initiative referendum recall, the 17th Amendment direct election of senators, and then child labor laws. And then we're going to describe the conservation movement that was began and developed by Theodore Roosevelt. Alright, so let's look at what changes. If you recall from our discussion of the new breed of politicians that come out after the Civil War, they were about big business and helping big business in this industrialization period, and they were helping railroads and oil and steel, and they run under this policy known as laissez-faire or laissez-faire. And we did use the vocabulary word laissez-faire. It's a French word that means let do or let them do, leave them alone, hands off. We talked about that. And in reference to the role of government and business, let businesses do, leave them alone, don't regulate them, don't mess with them. So laissez-faire is a policy. We're talking about an economic environment in which transactions between private parties are free from government restrictions, with only enough regulations to protect property rights. And what we're referring to here is a totally free economic market. Okay? And the characteristics of a laissez-faire policy in government was little to no intervention by the government on issues like child labor. Was government doing anything about child labor? No. So it's practicing laissez-faire while these businesses were using children to work. How about industry safety? These businesses were allowing these moving chains and parts to be not covered by safety material. The workers weren't wearing hard hats or safety glasses or earplugs, and so the government didn't do anything about that, and a lot of kids got hurt, lost fingers, lost arms, and a lot of other people did as well. We saw that. Water quality and air quality, we see that in the cities like New York, 1,500 people died during the summer because there was no ventilation in the home. We saw that a cholera outbreak happened early 1900. It spread through the city through water. And we see there was discrimination in employment. African Americans were not hired, and even in society, we had segregated society where blacks and whites were kept separate, and the government did nothing about these things. Unequal pay between men and women, government did nothing at all. Unfair business competition, we're about to talk about that in a second. Standard Oil Company here, with John D. Rockefeller, the government didn't do anything about him forming a trust or Carnegie forming a monopoly either. And so these are laissez-faire policies. These breaker boys, we looked at a picture of them in a coal mine, these small children working in there. And then we didn't discuss this one, but the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, its fire in New York City, where they had locked the doors of this tall building while over 200 women were inside, and it caught on fire. And they locked the doors to keep them from stealing shirts or fabric. When the fire caught, the building come down, and a lot of women died inside of that fire. So it pushed a lot of people to push for the government to do something. And here they didn't do anything to these businesses that cause these fire hazards and unsafe working conditions and child labor and these monopolies. And some non-examples of laissez-faire today that we have: OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, is actually a government regulatory agency that goes out and checks for fire code and safety things in these businesses. And child labor laws, we have laws against working children. We also have the Clayton Antitrust Act and a lot of other acts that say we can't have unfair competition between business. You can't form monopolies anymore, anti-monopoly. And then the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is to make sure that we don't discriminate on the basis of race or age or any other matters in employment. And then we have the Environmental Protection Agency that looks at how these businesses are affecting the water and air quality. And we also have inner city codes that talk about, the ventilation of buildings and how many people can stay in one building, fire code. And workers' compensation, when people get hurt on the job, it's the business's job now to make sure that they're compensated for their loss, that their hospital bills are paid, that they're given time, money and payment for time off work because of their they're being hurt on the job. These are non-examples of things we have today, and the reason we have these things today here is because of a group of people who push for government actions, called themselves the progressives, or they were called the progressives. And we're going to be looking at those during this progressive era. So we see that these politicians actually run under this laissez-faire policy that was actually put forth by Adam Smith, an English economist, in his book The Wealth of Nations, where he said he has never known much good to those who affected the trade of businesses for the public good. In other words, to help the public good. And we're going to see this laissez-faire is going to change, and we're going to reduce its role, the role of the government. We're going to change the role of government from this to something else. And we see that the government protected, through tariffs and by this laissez-faire system, and allowed for these ambitious and ruthless entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. See, this movement of industrialization, this rapid industrialization in the United States, these men here were great for America in one respect, because the economy exploded with growth. But they controlled the economy. Men like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, these captains of industry. It was good for our country because we become more wealthy. More jobs were being given out to people. That was a good thing. But on the same token, they created these unfair monopolies and ruined small businesses and run them out of business, and using these protections provided by the government. And then we saw also that a lot of things were happening with, they really were out to make a profit. They really didn't care about the people's welfare. If they had, they would have required working hats, hard hats in the mill, or glasses, or earplugs, or guards over these moving parts. But those things cost money, and so they were after profit, and that wasn't their main concern. They were after business efficiency and making money. And so we see that they formed these monopolies that were unfair economic situations, and we talked about the definition here, and you can pause it here and look at this if you'd like to refresh your memory. But then we also talked about urbanization and immigration, and how they impacted America. These rapid people from rural areas moving to the cities for jobs and in these factories, and then immigration into the country from southern and eastern Europe. And we saw these people come looking for jobs, and we saw overcrowding that's going to lead to diseases and a lot of contamination within the cities with bacteria like cholera and all. And then we saw tenement houses, overcrowding of housing, unsanitary water, the cholera outbreak, these fire hazards that were going on, child labor being used, unequal pay, long work hours, unsafe working conditions, extreme poverty, and political corruption. I'm going to talk about Boss Tweed later on in another video. And then these 4 areas: housing, health, working conditions, and political issues, they were problems. And so under laissez-faire, they were not really addressed. The government was inactive and did nothing about it. So if we look at this visual representation, the role of the United States government, what was it? Under this laissez-faire policy by the government, it was to leave it alone. Don't mess with trade, don't mess with business. Adam Smith said in his Wealth of Nations, be inactive. Don't do anything at all. And that's exactly what they did. And these problems surfaced under rapid industrialization, and then under rapid immigration and urbanization, the growth of these cities and overpopulation of them. The government stood back and did nothing at all. But during the progressive era, a group of people are going to come out and they're going to call for the government to change its role to being active, to do something about these problems. That democracy requires that government do something to help the people, contrary to what Adam Smith said. So this is going to be the change of the role in the United States government. It's going to change from inactive to active, and we're going to look at how those happen. So progressive era from 1900 to 1917 was a movement that called for more government action in the regulation of business, in the regulation of the work environment, and called for laws governing morality, standards in education, and city development to improve society's ills. Some characteristics they called for were minimum wage laws, child labor laws, 40-hour work weeks, safety laws, laws protecting unions, and some examples that are going to come out of this are the Meat Inspection Act, the conservation movement to save the forest in the West. Non-examples are laissez-faire, hands-off policies, and that's what the progressive era is there defined. Okay, so we look at this movement that call for more government action and regulation of business work environment, call for these laws. Okay, so we're going to see the role of the government change from inactive to active, and that brings us to 13A. Explain Upton Sinclairs The Jungle and federal oversight of the meatpacking industry. So we're going to look at this author named Upton Sinclair. He's a muckraker. We're going to talk about that later on. He wrote this book called The Jungle, and he's going to ask for federal oversight, push for federal oversight of the meatpacking industry in Chicago. So our focus is on the jungle. Our themes are Upton Sinclair as a social reformer, The Jungle, the book, as a muckraking piece of work. Okay. Federal oversight is this political reform and change in the role of government to being active. All right. So Upton Sinclair, this guy here, wrote this book, The Jungle, and in it he exposed unsanitary, unclean methods used by Chicago meatpacking industry, the Chicago meatpacking industry. And we talked about before, when we talked about the urbanization and growth of the cities, how Chicago became a huge area of urbanization. And right outside of Chicago was the Pullman cart company. We talked about that. But we also said they formed these ethnic ghettos and these Czechoslovakian ethnic enclaves. And here in green, out in here, was the culture that Upton Sinclair used in his book. A Czechoslovakian worker named Ruckus Yurkus was the character in this book, The Jungle. And in it, Upton Sinclair really he intended when he wrote the book, his intentions were to get the public sympathy for the conditions that foreign workers had to work in. And he was telling a story about Ruckus Yurkus and how he worked in this Chicago meatpacking industry and how they were treated badly and all, but he wrote in such great detail. Ruckus Yurkus was a Czechoslovakian. And that's where he come from, Czechoslovakia. But Upton Sinclair wrote in such great detail that he opened up some details about the sanitary conditions within the factory, and it made the public sick to their stomach. and he wrote in there about these conditions in which cattle were being held, and they were brought to slaughter in companies in Chicago like Swift and Company. How they were brought in there and then slaughtered, the conditions and process that was used. And in it, let's look at a piece. He said, it was dark in these storage places. It was too dark in these storage places to see well. But a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. Dried dung is the poop of these rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poison bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into hoppers together. That is sick. That is nasty. So he's talking about these hoppers here where the meat's going in to be ground up, and these open vats here without tops on them. And these rats, this meat was kept, had this rat poop here, the dung, and here's the rat here. They would crawl across these beams at the top here, and this dung would fall down into the meat. And in the storage places, the dung could be raked off the top of this meat, and that's what they do, clean it up, and then send it out for people to eat. So people, when they read this, became really sick about the matter. President Theodore Roosevelt's going to read this book. Let's look at another section. He says, we saw meat shoveled from filthy wooden floors, piled on tables rarely washed, pushed from room to room in rotten box carts, and all of which processes it was in the way of gathering dirt, splinters, floor filth, and the expectoration, that's the spit, of tuberculosis and other diseased workers. Man, that makes me not want to go out and eat at a restaurant. But anyway, you see he's exposing what's going on inside of these meals. And if you notice this beef laying on the floor here, draped across this thing here, just laid it anywhere. There was no really orderly or clean process in which they were cutting this meat up. And this rat dung and splinters and wood and everything else they'd spit in these areas around this meat, and it was pretty nasty. So he was trying to get the plight of these workers, especially the Czechoslovakian ones, Russians, but the people saw this nastiness and became concerned about sanitary conditions. Upton Sinclair wrote in the beginning of his second edition, I think, of the book, he says, I aimed for the public's hearts, in other words, to get sympathy for the workers, and accidentally hit its stomach, made it sick. And a lot of postcards were sent out from South Africa, cattle companies trying to play in on this and hurt American industry. And some of the postcards were pretty funny, but at the same time sickening, showing the Chicago Meat Company's unsanitary use of packing meat for their consumers. Here's another one here, and really showing how the people were reacting to this incident, and all this was brought out, the attention was brought out, excuse me, let me turn that back, by The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, this muckraker that exposed these unsanitary practices. Investigative journalism at its best, and we see these postcards are poking fun at, the cattle industry or Chicago Meatpacking Company. And they show you how people were responding to this unsanitary conditions. And then there were some groups, political groups like Housewives comes out in an alliance to put political pressure on the United States government to do something about this. These Housewives alliance that demand proper inspection of meat. They boycotted the meat in Chicago and all over the country, and it refused to buy it. And Theodore Roosevelt, who read the book, took a quote from John Bunyan's character in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. A man that could look nowhere but downwards with a muck rake in his hands. He says, muck rakers are often indispensable to society. In other words, we need them. but only when they know when to stop raking the muck. So the name muckrakers coming about because of Ida Tarbell and because of Upton Sinclair. These writers, these investigative journalists, go out and find this nastiness in society and show it to the world, illuminate all this nastiness. And here's a cartoon here showing Theodore Roosevelt. And he did investigate these meatpacking companies in Chicago, found that what Upton Sinclair said was true, and then he's going to ask Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act, where the federal government goes and inspects the meat, and they do. They actually do. So, in this analogy of muckraker, what does it mean? As a kid, I remember going out and fishing in ponds, and this algae that was floating on top of the water, we called it pond scum, or muck. And I remember at one time reaching down and picking it up with my hand and showing it to some of my relatives and saying, look at this nasty junk here. And I think that's what they meant by muck raking, is that Upton Sinclair, through his writing, not literally but figuratively through his writing, showed the muck to public at large. When they saw it, it grossed them out, and they called for government action. And with that government action, Congress is going to pass 2 laws in 1906, and the Pure Food and Drug Act required that companies accurately label the ingredients contained in processed food items, like meat. Placed restrictions on the makers of prepared foods and patent medicines, and forbade the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated, misbranded, or harmful foods, drugs, and liquors for the American public, what we call interstate commerce in government class. And the Meat Inspection Act in 1906 was a response to Sinclair's The Jungle, and this law required that meat processing plants be inspected by federal employees to ensure the use of good meat and health-minded procedures, and empowered officials in the Department of Agriculture to impose sanitation standards. And so we see, because of Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, in the progressive era, we see that laissez-faire, doing nothing at all, did not work, but the progressive muckraker Upton Sinclair put pressure on the government by making the people sick to pass this meat inspection, and it does. We see the role of the government here becomes progressive or active, and it passes this Meat Inspection Act. Okay, and we see now a little bit more cleanly and orderly environment in which meat is processed, not laid on the floor. These men wearing white coats have to butcher this meat, and as it hangs, and not on the floor, and sanitary conditions must be held. Cleaned areas must be cleaned thoroughly. And we see that here's a government inspector that come in to look at this meat, and is going to take a piece of it with him and take it to a lab, and the United States Department of Agriculture is going to have a federal employee in there to inspect it and make sure it's fit for consumption by the consumers. And USDA means United States Department of Agriculture, and they're going to put a little stamp on the meat saying that it has been inspected and it is consumable. And here's some. If you go into Walmart, or if you go into your local grocery store here in Bainbridge, you'll see that some of these inspections are on the plastic cover, or some are actually on the meat themselves where they've been inspected. And we see that they use science in these labs to inspect this meat to make sure there's no bacteria or anything that will hurt people who are eating it. And I think at that we have met our standard. You can watch this over again, but we were supposed to explain Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and the federal oversight of the meat packing industry. Good luck on the quiz and the test and the EOCT. Raise your hand in class if you have questions. Faire or laissez-faire, and we did use the vocabulary word laissez-faire. Means, it's a French word that means let do or let them do, leave them alone, hands off. We talked about that. And in reference to the role of government and business, let businesses do, leave them alone, don't regulate them, don't mess with them. So laissez-faire is a policy. We're talking about an economic environment in which transactions between private parties are free from government restrictions, with only enough regulations to protect property rights. And what we're referring to here is a totally free economic market. Okay? And the characteristics of a laissez-faire policy in government was little to no intervention by the government on issues like child labor. Was government doing anything about child labor? No. So it's practicing laissez-faire while these businesses were using children to work. How about industry safety? These businesses were allowing these moving chains and parts to be not covered by safety material. The workers weren't wearing hard hats or safety glasses or earplugs. And so the government didn't do anything about that. And a lot of kids got hurt, lost fingers, lost arms, and a lot of other people did as well. We saw that. Water quality and air quality, we see that in the cities like New York, 1,500 people died during the summer because there was no ventilation in the home. We saw that a cholera outbreak happened early 1900. It spread through the city through water. And we see there was discrimination in employment. African Americans were not hired, and even in society, we had segregation in the society and in the economy is going to change dramatically. Alright, so here it is. 13 says the student will identify major efforts to reform American society and politics in the progressive era. So we're gonna have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 substandards. Big area, big huge standard. In Unit 5 here, we're going to finish up our Unit 5 with this standard here. Let's highlight a few of these things and look at them. Upton Sinclairs The Jungle is going to lead to a change in government action, and it's going to lead to federal oversight of the meatpacking industry. The government's going to look closer at the meatpacking industry. And then Jane Addams' Hull House, her reform movements started with women trying to reform society. And then the rise of Jim Crow, or segregation in the South, in this Plessy versus Ferguson case, and then the advent or rise of the NAACP. And then Ida Tarbell, as a muckraker, illuminating her role as a muckraker and that of Upton Sinclairs The Jungle as well. And then the significance of progressive reform in politics, such as the initiative referendum recall, the 17th Amendment direct election of senators, and then child labor laws. And then we're going to describe the conservation movement that was began and developed by Theodore Roosevelt. Alright, so let's look at what changes. If you recall from our discussion of the new breed of politicians that come out after the Civil War, they were about big business and helping big business in this industrialization period, and they were helping railroads and oil and steel, and they run under this policy known as laissez-faire. Okay, let's move on to Standard 13. Let's look at the overall standard here. The student will identify major efforts to reform American society and politics. So they're going to reform American society, and they want to reform or change American politics in the progressive era. That's our overall focus. So we're going to be looking at this progressive era, and we see reform means change. We talked about that definition before. American society and American politics are going to change during this era we call the progressive era, from around 1900 to 1917, 17 years. And we're going to be looking at primarily the changing of the role of government is a big one we're going to look at. So government's role